In this video we're going to look at models for understanding culture. There are many and varied attempts that have been made to present the essentials of culture in a diagrammatic way, and in this video I will critically consider some of these attempts and recommend a particular model for understanding culture. Well, model number one, Barney's model. Our first model is one that was proposed by Linwood Barney. Linwood Barney was an anthropologist and also a former missionary to the Hmong people of Laos and Vietnam. Look at this representation of his four-layer model of culture, which has proved influential. This model involves four concentric circles, and Barney likened understanding to the peeling of an onion. Barney defines culture as the acquired knowledge that people use to interpret experience and generate social behaviour. And at the heart of Barney's model of culture stands, as you can see in this diagram, worldview. And when Barney thinks of worldview, he's thinking of cosmology, what people as cultural beings believe and think about the universe and what it is, its origin or eternal nature or whatever. He also included ideology and systems of ideas which, for example, may lie behind the views that people have of such things as economics and politics, Marxism, liberation theology, whatever. And worldview involves our fundamental presuppositions, our convictions and beliefs about God and about the nature of people, history and its meaning, and everything else that matters. And in Barney's view, it is this core worldview that gives rise to and finds expression in those things which people value. And the institutions one finds in any particular cultural setting are organised and function in a way that results from and expresses the underlying values and worldview of that culture. Barney distinguished between social institutions, political institutions and economic institutions. And under the rubric of social institutions he included such things as family, language, medicine, education and athletics. Political institutions covered community organisations, government, law, mythology and penal sanctions. Economic institutions embraced cooperative labour, housing, inheritance rights, property rights and trade. Barney understood that people live virtually all of their lives in some institutional setting or other, and that people's behaviour in any particular culture and the material artefacts that we associate with a culture will therefore reflect such institutional life and the values and the worldview underpinning it. Now, material artefacts are things that human beings have made, and this therefore includes a vast range of objects, tools, machines, weapons, adornments, artworks, and so on. We'll have a bit more to say about material artefacts, cultural artefacts later. In presenting his model of culture, Barney was particularly concerned about the communication of the gospel, and his model was intended to underscore the importance of communicating the gospel in such a way as to bring about a change in worldviews and not to be content with merely seeking superficial behavioural change. Missiologist Bruce Nichols, who is a founder of the Asia Theological Association and the Theological Commission of the World Evangelical Fellowship, he adopted Barney's view, as you can see in this representation. Now, as you can see, Nichols moves away from the onion model. He prefers building imagery, and so he speaks of surface layers that build on these deeper layers. And he saw religion as influencing all layers. And so he would say that when religious faith is genuinely held, it will always involve the deepest layer of culture, which, like Barney, Nichols understands to be ideology and cosmology and worldview. Now, in his book, Contextualization, Meanings, Methods and Models, David Hesselgrave warns against the danger of thinking that culture captures the whole of realities experienced by people. Now, we are aware of the view of many that religion is a human product. And if that is the case, then religion can be subsumed under the category of culture. However, human culture does not take into account the impact upon it at all levels of what we might call spiritual warfare, the conflict between divine and satanic forces. We remember that Jesus regularly exorcised demons, and the observable behaviour of individuals was significantly altered by the phenomenon of demon possession. And so it was that a demon, having possessed a boy, would throw him into the fire or into water. Read that in Matthew 17. And so it was that a man possessed by many demons could tear apart chains that bound him and break the irons on his feet, something otherwise would be impossible for a human being to do. And this same man spent much of his life among the tombs, and he cried out and cut himself with stones. We read in Acts 19 that about 7 Jewish brothers who tried to exorcise a demon, and the man possessed by the demon overpowered all 7 of them and gave them such a beating that they ran out of the house naked and bleeding. Now, in all instances where demons were exorcised, deviant behaviour ceased, which makes it apparent that such behaviour could not be explained by culture. By contrast, the Old Testament's replete with examples of the Spirit of Yahweh coming upon people and causing them to behave in ways that were not natural. Now, at one time God took some of the power of the Spirit that was on Moses and put it on the 70 elders. And when the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied, but did not do so again. We read about that in Numbers chapter 11. And sometimes God commanded prophets to behave in bizarre ways by way of providing his people with graphic symbols. Now, for example, Ezekiel lay on his side for 390 days and then on his right side for a further 40 days. That's mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 4. And along with this, Ezekiel, at God's command, did something entirely unacceptable in his culture, using human excrement for cooking fuel. And it was as one filled with the Holy Spirit that Peter spoke boldly about Christ to the hostile religious authorities of his day. And likewise, it was when Stephen was filled with the Holy Spirit that he looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God, and he cried out, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them," as he was stoned to death. Now, none of these modes of behaviour emanated from culture, whether we're talking about behaviour that's been influenced by demonic forces or by the Spirit of God, not from culturism. Now consider institutions. Is everything we see in institutional life purely cultural? Well, as noted above, Barney discriminated between 3 types of institutions: social, political and economic. Now, whatever meaning we might load into the word institution, institutions are all social settings within which human behaviour finds expression. And indeed, all observable human behaviour takes place in a social setting. I mean, you might consider the 10 plagues that God visited on Egypt, when God displayed his matchless glory for all the world to see. There was an established institution of magicians within Egypt, and these magicians, by their secret arts, were able to transform their staffs into snakes. We read about this next in Exodus chapter 7. They were able to transform water into blood. They also were able to cause a plague of frogs. In the ancient Near East, as we see from the book of Daniel, this institution involved considerable training to equip such people to understand all kinds of literature and learning, including the interpretation of visions and dreams. And indeed, this was the science of its day, involving the systematic study of such phenomena and scholarly attempts to identify ways of understanding and manipulating powers that were experienced as part of life. and few, if any, of which were thought to be purely natural in the ancient world. Many of the interactions of magicians with such phenomena expressed learned behaviour, and as such were cultural. And yet it's clear, isn't it, from the example of the Egyptian magicians, that there were forces at play that transcended that which can be subsumed within culture. And similarly in Daniel we see examples of the impact of royal visions and dreams on the institutional workings of Babylonian and Persian government and such institutions as law. In Daniel 10, the political and military landscape of the Persian and Greek empires is seen to be an outworking of a battle in the heavenly places between the Archangel Michael, one of the chief princes, and the angelic prince of Persia. And when God turned the waters of the Nile into blood, he made it impossible for Egyptians to get water for themselves in normal, institutionalized ways. And so we read in Exodus chapter 7, and all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water because they could not drink the water of the river. Upon a closer analysis of the values and beliefs and views of people, we see that they too cannot merely be explained as the products of cultural processes. We are explicitly and repeatedly told that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and we're to understand that at a profound level his attitudes and perspectives are not explicable merely as expressions of who he was as a cultural being. In Romans chapter 1, Paul describes all people as not treating the knowledge of God as possessing worth or value. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, he explains the failure of people to see the supreme worth of Christ as being due to their being blinded by the god of this age, Satan. So it follows from the above reflections that when we look at culture from a Christian perspective, a biblical perspective, we must not think of culture, for all its utility as a descriptor, as being capable of fully explaining all human behaviour, institutional life, values, beliefs and perspectives. Anyway, so much for some comments on model number 1. We now turn to the second model, which is that presented by Lloyd Kwast. Now it's very similar to that of Barney, his model. It also involves what we might call an onion model. Kwast found it helpful to think of culture as it would appear to a Martian who landed on our planet. And so as a result, culture is first approached through observable behaviour. That's how it would appear to a Martian first off, wouldn't it? So whereas Barney's model involves a movement from the centre of what we might think of as the wheel, the worldview, to its rim behaviour, Kwast moves the other way from the rim to the centre. And it is significant that Kwast discriminates between beliefs and worldview. For Kwast, beliefs are the basis of beliefs about truth and beliefs that help them to understand the world and other people. So people have beliefs that they merely profess, but they also have beliefs which shape how they live. But in Kwast's mind, all of these beliefs are derived from foundational assumptions about the deepest issues of existence, what Kwast describes as a vision of the world or worldview. Now, Kwast has a missiological reason for discriminating between beliefs and worldview. He argues that worldview produces a system of beliefs which are then reflected in people's actual values and behaviour. However, he observes that sometimes a new or competing system of beliefs is introduced while leaving the worldview unchallenged and unchanged. Now we might think here of missionaries bringing in a Christian system of beliefs and of the people to whom they're ministering seeming to adopt this system. However, as Kwast observes, missionaries are often disappointed by the lack of genuine change their efforts produce, and he attributes this to a failure to adequately address the worldview. A bit like Barney. So while this distinction between worldview and an imposed system of beliefs needs to be borne in mind, the reality is that if people's values and behaviour is not changed, then it is because their real beliefs are not one and the same as the beliefs expressed in the system imposed on them, even if in an institutional setting such as church they give verbal assent to such beliefs. And so consequently, the distinction between beliefs and worldview is dubious. We turn to our third model of culture, which is Schein's model. Edgar Schein specialised in explaining organisational culture. Now, Schein believes that the first fundamental level at which a culture manifests itself is that of artefacts. And this is what one, on entering a culture, observes and feels. Now, for Schein, artefacts comprehends a vast array of visible and audible behaviour, patterns, technology, and art. For example, the way that people address each other, their dress code, the physical layout of a place, its smell and feel, people's emotional intensity, records, documents, and so on. And Schein points out that when we seek to understand the values that explain why members of a culture behave as they do, we run into a problem. Because when we get down to the second level, we're often exposed merely to the manifest or the espoused values of a culture. The focus is on what people say is the reason for their behaviour, what ideally they would like those reasons to be, but very often we encounter rationalisations for behaviour while we remain in the dark as to the real underlying reasons for behaviour. And that's why there's this need to probe the level of underlying assumptions. Well, let's turn now from Schein's model to our fourth model, which is the model of David Hesselgrave. Now again, David Hesselgrave's schema, it's similar to that of Barney and Kwast, but rather than discriminating between values and beliefs and worldview, what Hesselgrave does is he conflates them under the category of what he calls ideological. And he has a technological layer which incorporates what Barney and Kwast dub behaviour. Behaviour is described by Hesselgrave as being basically just activities. Now, he uses the term artefact or artefact. You can spell it two ways, but it's a very slippery term. Anthropologists are not consistent in the way they use this word. For some, cultural artefacts simply describe anything that's created by humans that gives information about the culture of its creator and users. And this information may provide knowledge about the technological, the economic, political or religious organisation of the people to whom the artefacts belong. But not everything that is of importance to an individual is of cultural significance. Now, my Samsung Galaxy tablet is a cultural artefact because it tells us a lot about how communication takes place in our society. However, in a chapter for the ASA Handbook of Social Anthropology, Liana Schur and Miria Salmond, they say this: by artefacts, we refer not simply to made physical objects, but also to documents, environmental features, sensory, emotive, and corporeal experiences, and even seemingly intangible but distinctive forms such as ghosts, the law, forms of intellectual and cultural property, virtual networks, CT scans and thunderstorms, all of which give shape and substance to people's lives. So being part of and moulded by this world is anthropology's signature method. As novice field workers invariably discover, learning to perform such mundane tasks as sipping tea, walking through crowds, or performing public ablutions are often the very ways in which they become socialised, accepted, and given access to local knowledge. Moreover, the tools of the ethnographic trade, notebooks, pens and pencils, cameras, voice recorders, laptops, gifts from home, are integral and prominent aspects of their presence in the field, inseparable from the insights thus accrued. So just something to reflect upon when we think of cultural artefacts. We turn now to the fifth model, which is that presented by Harold Turner. Now, Harold Turner is a New Zealand missiologist, and Turner sees most overseas missionary work as having a holistic approach addressing all three levels of human existence, what he calls the individual personal, the public social, and the deeper cultural. Now, it is what Turner dubs the deeper cultural that Turner regards as the basic culture, with language being its first expression. Now, concerning the first two levels, this is how Turner explains things. He says that the local situation required missionaries to start at the first level, that of the individual, with sole converts or small groups. But they also had to address the second level, that of social systems, such as the structures of marriage, the place of women, the treatment of disease, payback, revenge, and many other areas demanding reform in the direction of God's kingdom. Now, Turner maintains that although missionaries address all three levels in our own countries, it is the third level that is often ignored or neglected. And he observes that in our own societies, the chief focus of evangelicals is on level one, the individual. And it's often the more liberal constituency, especially in mainline churches, that involves itself more in the reform of social systems and structures and focus on issues such as rights and ecology and peace and feminism and so on. Significantly, Turner contends, while our missionaries overseas study the worldviews and the basic assumptions of tribal and other cultures, at level 3, in order to bring a biblical critique to bear at this level, a similar concern in our own sending countries to bring the gospel to bear on the very roots of our culture has been almost totally absent. And one key reason for this is the common tendency to operate with a surface view of culture, the popular view that limits culture to our various traditions, foods and clothing and housing and entertainment and parties, music, art, styles, greetings, births, marriages and funerals, anniversaries, etc. Turner argues that if Christianity is to do more than counsel individuals at the private level, or avoid becoming an increasingly weak and parasitic ally of liberal humanistic forces operating mainly at level 2, it must cross this new mission frontier to level 3 and engage with all serious-minded people in a profound re-examination of the very bases of Western culture. Well, we move from Turner's model to our sixth model, which is the model of Scott Moreau. Now, in his model, Scott Moreau begins with human universals. And here Moreau observes that all cultures build off the basic block of what it means to be human. So every culture has a common human core. And so it is that the characteristics of all cultures build on our humanity. And this includes facts of language and institutions, the need for values, social interactions, and so on. When you move up to level 2, what he calls national cultural particulars, Moreau observes that each cultural unit or geopolitical nation has chosen particular ways to adapt to its environment in light of its historical development. Contemporary constraints of national units include such things as the need for visas to cross borders, the reality of national level governments, official country languages and school systems. And all such factors help to mould and shape culture at a national level. At level 3, it's recognised that within the national or larger cultural context, that each ethnic group, on down to the family level, chooses its own cultural adaptations. So every family unit ingrains into its members its own set of values, which to some degree will involve borrowing the culture of which the family unit is a part, whether the family is extended or nuclear. At level 4, Moreau appreciates that every human being is more than just a product of culture. So if we all enter the world with a genetic predisposition to favour certain characteristics, for example, shyness or sociability, and because people are created in God's image, they have a God-given ability to choose or accept the values they are exposed to. And Moreau also notes that every person belongs to a number of different microcultures, so that people are something of a conglomeration of such cultures, each with its distinct rules of operation, but with many common threads interwoven among them. For example, business and home and school and church and friendships and so on. Moving from Moreau's model, let's now move to our 7th model, which is that of Geert Hofstede, off-cited, because Geert Hofstede is renowned for his groundbreaking and extensive research into national cultures. Now, Hofstede observes that some nations are more culturally homogeneous than others. But within nations, especially large ones like Brazil or China or India or Indonesia, there are to be found culturally different regions. By contrast, especially in Africa, we find in different nations culturally similar areas. And research shows that national cultures differ in particular at the level of usually unconscious values held by a majority of the population. And when Hofstede speaks of values, he does not mean cherished moral convictions, but he has in mind broad preferences for one state of affairs over others. Statistical research initially led Hofstede to see the values that distinguish countries falling into 4 clusters. And subsequent research has resulted in Hofstede identifying a further 2 dimensions. And so the 6 dimensions, as labelled by Hofstede, are power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism, masculinity, long-term orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. And we will examine what Hofstede means by each of these value clusters later on when I talk about contextualisation in another video. But for now, the essential point to grasp is that these values are acquired in childhood, and as a consequence, national cultures are remarkably stable over time. It takes generations for these to change, and it is for this reason that differences between countries have such a remarkable historical continuity. And as circumstances change, we do see cultural practices changing, namely cultural symbols and heroes and rituals. And symbols are words and gestures and pictures or objects that carry a particular meaning, which is recognised by those who share a particular culture. Heroes are persons, past or present, real or imagined, who possess traits highly prized in a culture. Symbols are words, gestures, pictures or objects that carry a particular meaning, recognised by those who share a particular culture. Heroes are persons, past or present, real or imagined, who possess traits highly prized in a culture and therefore serve as models for behaviour. Rituals are collective activities that are technically superfluous, but within a particular culture socially essential. For example, greetings and how respect is shown. And such symbols and heroes and rituals are observable practices, though their cultural meaning requires interpretation. The term organisational culture refers to culture in any type of organisation, including schools and universities and not-for-profit groups, and churches and government agencies or business entities. And many people spend a great deal of their lives in such settings. Within a culture, it's broadly the case that differences between organisations are mainly at the level of cultural practices, symbols, heroes and rituals, rather than at the level of values as defined by Hofstede. Now we turn from Hofstede's model and we come to the final model, Wilson's model. In other words, it's my own model. And I've chosen a roulette wheel to represent my own model of culture. Now, one reason for this is because a roulette wheel is constantly spinning, which reminds us that culture is not static, but always moving, changing. Another reason for this choice is to remind us that culture has a bias. Just as a casino's roulette wheel is so designed that overall it will earn more for the casino than it will for luckless gamblers, so it is with culture. Using a similar image from the gambling world, Lingenfelter comments, "I reject the notion that culture or worldview is neutral. Analogies such as Kraft's map or a tool for communication interaction are inadequate to capture the pervasive presence of sin in the lives and thoughts of human beings." So using the tool analogy, culture is more like a slot machine found in Las Vegas's gambling casinos than it is a wrench or a screwdriver. And culture, like a slot machine, is programmed to be sure that those who hold power win and the common players lose. When or if the organised agenda is violated, people frequently resort to violence to re-establish their programmed advantage. And every cultural system brokers power to its members, although the power advantage may be held by either individuals or groups. The structures and organisations of cultures are not neutral. People define and structure their relationships with others to protect their personal or group interests and to sustain or gain advantage over others with whom they compete. Video games provide better analogies to culture than Kraft's map because they reflect the various power advantages, access to survival resources, and hostile opposition that typify cultural systems. Culture, then, is created and contaminated by human beings. Culture is the penitentiary of disobedience, from which freedom is possible only through the gospel. When I refer to structures, I include cultural artefacts, but I also have in mind the fact that all behaviour takes place in some setting that has been shaped by social and cultural forces. And that is why I have placed structures and behaviour in the same layer. Human behaviour takes place in homes or shopping malls or offices or churches, on farms, in criminal activity and so on. Some missiologists and anthropologists have placed special stress on observable behaviour. Now, some observable behaviour is non-cultural. Think of purely biological behaviours such as the blinking of our eyes and the natural operation of breathing. And think too of individual behaviour associated with an experience of supernatural phenomena such as we were talking about at the beginning of this video, or early on in this video. But apart from such exceptions, all of our behaviour is learned and therefore cultural. And so behaviour includes what we do in private as well as what we do when observed by others. Our behaviour, and indeed the very form and nature of our social settings, is an inevitable expression of underlying values, both our strong preferences in the Hofstedian sense and our moral values. And in one culture, direct eye contact may presuppose such values as honesty and attentiveness, and indirect eye contact may be construed as expressing shiftiness and disregard. And yet, in another culture, direct eye contact may be seen as aggressive, while indirect eye contact might convey respect and humility. So now we come to the crunch issue. the vast majority of models of culture presuppose that when all the layers of culture have been peeled away, we will find at the very core of culture what some call worldview, beliefs and assumptions about reality. Now, I'll address this issue more fully when we later consider the whole matter of worldview in another video, but what we should not omit to mention is that all of the dominant models of culture have been conceived by Westerners, and the Western worldview itself is highly ideational. So reasons and ideas are given an exaggerated significance in Western thought. And I would contend that we have a distorted view of things if we think that an understanding of worldview alone is the key to understanding why people value the things they do and develop the structures characteristic of their society and culture and why they behave in the ways that they do. And the fact is that we never develop our worldviews in isolation. Our beliefs and our assumptions about reality are themselves profoundly shaped by our upbringing and all the socialising and enculturating processes to which we have been exposed. And that is why I place at the centre not only worldview, but also social influences. Now, there's one more thing we need to recognise. It would be incorrect to think that cultural forces only flow in one direction, from worldview, social influences to values, to structures, behaviour, although the current usually flows much more strongly in this direction. But changing behaviour or social and cultural structures may cause change in underlying values and even possibly in the worldview and social influences, especially when such behavioural and structural change is enforced over a significant period of time. To a profound extent, this is what appears to have happened in mainland China following the Cultural Revolution, even if there have been aspects of the traditional worldview that have persisted. For example, Mao Zedong was virulently opposed to religion and Confucianism. He never succeeded in stamping out either religion or Confucianism, but it is arguable that atheism is more strongly entrenched and that Confucian values are not as strong among mainland Chinese as they are among Chinese raised in many other societies. However, as Turner recognises, missionaries have sometimes effected changes in some areas of behaviour that have not really constituted a substantial change in worldview. People have become Christianised while holding essentially to the same basic beliefs and assumptions about reality that they had before the missionaries came. And hence you have Turner's exhortation to minister at the level of deep culture. In the light of my comments above, I would add that if culture is to be radically impacted by the gospel, then it's not merely beliefs and assumptions about reality that need to change, but also the very nature and workings of social influences. So there you have it, 8 models of culture.